I am. It looks great.
Lovely. Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here at the Student Undergraduate Research Experience for our presentation today. I'm Merle Massey, and I'm the Coordinator of Undergraduate Research, and I'm so delighted to present our special guest for the day. This is Dr. Erin Prosser-Loose, and she is the Senior Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist with the College of Medicine. And with that introduction, Dr. Prosser-Loose, I'm going to turn it directly over to you.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Merle, for inviting me to this. As I was saying, I did a very similar presentation for your group last summer. So if anyone was in attendance then or has watched that video, this might be a bit of a bit familiar, but hopefully that just kind of reinforces some of the things we're talking about here. And thanks everyone for joining on this beautiful day. I'm sure people would like to be outside, but you can hold on an hour. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we're here today to talk about EDI, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion in research, and specifically for undergraduate researchers. I mean, this topic is very transferable across different populations of researchers, but I really want to kind of give you a wide, kind of broad overview, the gist of why this is important in research. And of course, even though we're virtual, we still want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, at least I am, and homeland of the Métis. Wherever you are. Oh, am I sharing my notes slide? There we go. Is that better?
Thanks, Erin.
Nope, thank you for that. No one needs to see my notes. So yes, I acknowledge I'm on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. Wherever you are, I would, ask you take a minute to just acknowledge what treaty you are in. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Okay, so I just want to do a quick introduction of who I am so you get an idea of where I'm coming from. My background is research. I did a PhD in neuroscience, finished in 2010, and then did a postdoc here at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine. From there, I worked as a research coordinator in the Department of Pediatrics for 5 years. And then I really became kind of solidly working in the EDI space, specifically from a research perspective in the College of Medicine. And then just as of last July, my role got moved to senior EDI specialist. I'm within the division of faculty engagement in that portfolio, but I still do work with staff and students in this role. So given that my background is science, you're going to see a lot of the examples I'm using are going to come from that lens, but the main kind of issues are very common throughout fields in academia. Okay, so I want to start with this research study from 2012. Some of you might be familiar with it. So science professors were given resumes of undergraduate students applying for a lab manager position, and they were given these resumes either from a student named John or a student named Jennifer. And the professors were asked to rank these CVs or these resumes on three things: perceived competence, hireability, and whether they felt the candidate was deserving of mentorship. Back to my notes again. What the heck? Okay. You're good now? I think it's depending on where I put my mouse. That must be the problem. Okay. So the professors were asked to rank on these three things. And as you can see from the graph here, the results show that on all three of these measures, John scored higher than Jennifer and was offered on average $4,000 more in salary. And of course, the glitch is here that the resumes were absolutely identical except for the names. What is also interesting to note and important to note is that professors had this bias independent of their own gender. So meaning that women also scored John higher. So this kind of highlights how all of us have biases. Biases aren't specific to one type of person. We all have them. And there has been similar studies using white versus racialized sounding names. And then actually one just that came out, I believe, just this month, that found that identical CVs with male names received higher scores in all categories measured compared to women. So one example of that, men were 75% more likely to be seen as having leadership potential than, the identical CV from a woman. So that just shows, this study I showed here is from 2012, but in 2021, we're still finding similar things. So we are here today to discuss EDI in research, and I hope this example reflects why this is important. Okay, so we're going to start by defining EDI. What is it? Then we'll take a look at why it's important in research, and then finish with just some ideas how you as undergraduate students can develop your own competence in EDI. Okay, so what is EDI? I'm curious what you folks think. What do you think of when you hear equity, diversity, and inclusion? If you want to put that in the chat, if Merle, if you're able to read that out to me, if people respond, I'm not able to see the chat at the moment.
I sure can.
Thank you.
Diverse research teams.
Very important.
Fair.
Fairness is important.
Diverse research subjects.
Yes.
Community-based or community-grounded research. Allyship. Empathy.
Yeah, these are all really great. No, I love all of those, and we hit on a couple of them in this presentation. So I especially like how people picked out that, it's important both at the researcher level, who is doing the research, and then also the research participant level, right? Who are we doing research with and for? Okay. So let's actually define these terms. So equity is the what. So this is actually providing each individual with what they need to be successful. It's different than equality, and this is a really important distinction to make. Equality is providing us all with same or similar opportunities, right? So you can see in this graphic here, equality is giving everybody the same size of box, no matter where they're starting from. But when we talk about equity, we're looking at really assessing the barriers that each individual person has and providing resources accordingly. So this is really acknowledging that people need different resources to essentially reach the same level of success. And you can see this visual takes it even further, looking at, in many cases, reality is that those that maybe already have some privilege or some, ease of access to resources actually get more than those who may need it more. And then liberation, of course, is there's no barriers to anybody. There's a word of caution with the specific graphic. It's a bit flawed because it kind of promotes what's called a deficit-based reasoning. So we're kind of looking at, this person who is short is somehow less than others. But the reality is that often people of equal or superior ability are still blocked from participating. So it's just something to keep in mind when you see these types of graphics. So diversity is the who. Who are we talking about? So everybody, people who are different from each other. We're all different in some way from each other. The range of human differences, and this includes diverse talents, perspectives, backgrounds, worldviews, ways of knowing, skills, opinions, and abilities. And of course, how we often think about it includes gender identity, sexual orientation, racial identity, ethnicities, cultures, etc. And inclusion. So this is really the how. So how do we make sure everybody has the opportunity to participate? This is, creating a culture and a space in which we all feel respected and valued, taking really solid action to create a supportive university community. So it's the active process of change, but it's also the outcome. So a person, to know we're doing inclusion, right? The person needs to feel included. So how are our actions actually contributing to how people are feeling? Belonging is a term that shows up a lot too when we're talking about EDI. So and I think it really does get down to a goal of what all of this is, maybe even better than the term inclusion. Um, and that I kind of touch on that here in the next slide. Okay, so these are just a couple important points that I want to point out. When we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's important to really recognize that equity is perhaps the most important of these to really focus on, um, because diversity and inclusion will be, you know, a fairly natural byproduct of designing equitable programs, equitable resources. And something I hear too is often marginalized folks might not want to be included in the current system the way it is. So of course, it is still important to work on what we're given and what we have right now, but also at the same time, really imagining and putting into practice new ways of doing things that are more equitable. Another thing to really be mindful of is that Indigenous peoples and indigenization is not to be subsumed under the EDI kind of umbrella or envelope. So certainly those of us who work in EDI work to ensure we're aware and meeting the needs of Indigenous peoples, but the unique history of Indigenous peoples in this country, their distinction in the Canadian Constitution, really requires a focused attention and focused resources. And so we see that here at USask, the Office of Indigenous Engagement. Several colleges have, Indigenous focused initiatives and groups. So just be careful not to kind of subsume that under the umbrella of EDI. Okay, so this is the part that I really love talking about. Why is EDI important in research? So EDI is important because it's important in our society, in our communities, and our institutions, and all of these are intimately connected. So for example, we see the effects of racial inequities in society. That gets reflected in our institutions, among our researchers, and then even into the design of research projects. Vice versa too, though, right? Uh, who is included in our research can dictate who is being served in society at large. So going forward, we're going to kind of focus on these bottom two triangles, looking at researchers and research design, but with the recognition that we kind of swim in this larger sea of society and institution, and we breathe that air that is present at the broader space. Okay, so to understand why EDI is important among researchers, let's first look at what happens when EDI is not considered. I can't possibly cover every issue here, but I want to give you kind of a sampling. I think we'll share these slides, and so each of these links is active, and you can read up a little bit further on each of them. But when we see underrepresentation in and bias against who is doing the researchers, these can be some of the outcomes. So it's estimated that about 5 to 17% of faculty are racialized versus 22% in the Canadian population. So they're underrepresented among faculty in Canada. And it's really important that students that can actually see themselves reflected in their professors and supervisors. So having at least that representative population is really important. There's evidence that Black researchers receive less funding from the National Institutes of Health in the United States versus non-Black researchers. This third study found that scholars from underrepresented groups, specifically gender and racial minorities, actually achieved higher rates of scientific novelty, but their research was less likely to be taken up by peers, and these individuals were less likely to continue into scientific careers. So in STEM fields, which stands for science, tech, engineering, and math, there's a higher rate of attrition among women. So more women leave these fields when you go from a bachelor's of science into a PhD. Along that kind of route, we have a high attrition of women. There's been studies finding that there are gender differences in success rates for Canadian scientific research grants. So this is CIHR specifically, if people are familiar with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. This is our major health funder for Canada. And there has been evidence of gender differences in success rates, which they are addressing. So thankfully, they seem to be responsive. And then there's evidence that LGBTQ individuals face biases too that can result in barriers to opportunities and may be less likely to be represented again in STEM fields. Okay, so when EDI is not considered, so we previously looked at the researcher level, but what about in the design of research projects? So here is where we see underrepresentation, bias, and even unethical treatment in research design of participants, patients, etc. Again, just a kind of a sampling of some examples. Perhaps many of you are aware of there's a long and quite terrible history of unethical treatment of Indigenous peoples by researchers. This includes medical, nutritional experimentation, using blood samples for purposes other than originally stated, the taking of their data and not giving back to communities, and it kind of goes on and on. If any of you are working with cell lines, you might be familiar with HeLa cells, and you should really know the story behind them, if so. So very briefly, cells were taken from a young Black woman named Henrietta Lacks, who had cervical cancer, and these cells were taken without her knowledge or consent. They went on to be used as a model cell line because they had this really unique property of immortality and have been used worldwide. And I don't believe, I'm not sure to this day if her family has received any compensation or any kind of, uh, compensation for that. So health population algorithms, these are used to identify patients with complex health needs. And one has been shown to have significant racial bias, which results in Black patients not being identified and therefore possibly not receiving the care they needed. Genome data, many commonly used genome data sets are mainly composed of data from individuals with European ancestry. Less than 1% are from Indigenous ancestry. And this causes, potential difficulties in identifying genetic variants in patients who are not of European descent. Certainly, regarding especially the health research history, women were considered at a time always potentially pregnant, and so were not included in clinical trials. And then even at the animal research level, female animals were considered to have hormones that were just too complicated to deal with. So were often left out. If you look back at a lot of this literature, which is my background, it was always male animals being used. And then while men tend to be kind of the model for health research, they certainly have been excluded in some specific cases. So for example, breast cancer trials, men do get breast cancer. And I would say mental health is often, I think it's better now, but it has been fairly exclusionary of men. Okay, so let's flip this around. So what do we see when EDI is considered and diverse researchers are represented and equitably considered? So we see happier and more insightful researchers. And I know that sounds a little fluffy, but happier doesn't matter. When a person feels welcomed and valued and that they belong, that weight of being excluded is lifted and that energy can be focused on their work. So here's just a couple quotes that I thought really highlighted this idea. I have never felt more at home in a room full of strangers, to be honest. It truly was a great experience. So this is from a student who participated in an LGBTQ in STEM conference. And conferences are important. They're such a great way for students to really grow their networks and meet other people, but they can feel very isolating and exclusionary. And so this student had, this really great positive experience in a very inclusive environment. And I think it's not unfair to make the assumption that that meant they were better able to grow some networks and maybe communicate their research, all of which will help move them forward in their career. So this next quote, I thought this was a really cool initiative out of Western University where Indigenous undergrad students were paired with faculty researchers for summer projects that aimed to kind of marry the academic research methods with Indigenous ways of knowing. And this quote was from about one of the students. So this program helped him see parallels between Indigenous and scientific knowledge. As he spent the summer researching algae, he saw a similarity between the way that cells transfer energy and how elders transfer knowledge to the next generation. He also found himself singing to his cells the way he and his grandmother would sing to plants in her garden when he was growing up. And so I just think about the potential innovation and kind of new insights that a student who's had this experience could bring forward into a research career, and what would we be what society in general would be really missing out on if that person was excluded from moving forward in a research career. And then, of course, when EDI is considered in research design, we see better research outcomes. So diversity among researchers is reflected in research design, and this ultimately results in better, more robust research outcomes. So we know that diverse teams tend to focus on facts and process them more carefully than homogeneous teams. I think this makes sense. We're more aware of being clear with each other when we're communicating with a very heterogeneous group. We see increased innovation that comes from incorporating a variety of worldviews, experiences, ideas. Collective intelligence is a measure of group performance. And in this particular study, it was correlated positively correlated with the proportion of women in the group. And then interestingly, papers with 4 or 5 authors of multiple ethnicities have on average 5 to 10% more citations. That could be interpreted as having a greater impact as well. This study that our disabilities have made us better scientists. This showed how neurodivergence really helps with new lines of thinking, new idea generation and creative problem solving. Women researchers are more likely to include sex and gender considerations into their projects, so potentially producing outcomes that may be more broadly applicable. And then, of course, there's certainly evidence that Indigenous knowledge is not opposed to modern science and technology, but can actually help, they can help advance each other. And so what does all of this lead to? So I just wanted to share some of the important discoveries that have been made when EDI, in this case, specifically sex and gender, are considered in research design. These are specific to science, but I encourage you to kind of search the literature in your own fields and find out, what the history and what important discoveries have been made. So pain pathways differ between the sexes. So this was a really groundbreaking animal study from McGill, done in 2009, which included both male and female mice. And I want to emphasize this was not the norm in 2009 to be including female mice. Even on that alone, this was quite a groundbreaking study. And importantly, researchers found that pain results from very different pathways in male and female mice with distinct immune cell types contributing. So thinking about how this could translate to humans, 20% of people worldwide experience chronic pain, and the majority are women. So today, the pharmaceutical market offers the same pain drugs to everyone, kind of regardless of sex. But if the roots of pain are indeed different, some drugs might work better, in women versus men than others. So really important discovery there. This second study I thought was so interesting. So it showed that gender-related characteristics, so things like social roles, things like that, so not female sex, not biological female sex, was actually predictive of increased risk of recurrent acute coronary syndrome. So this study really highlights the importance of thinking about sociocultural factors, even in biological studies. And this last study I thought was just so fascinating. If you do animal research, I encourage you to read this. It's so interesting. So it's not only important to include female animals in your work, but also to think about the conditions. So this study actually found that male animal handlers caused increased stress and anxiety in their study animals, in their rodents. And it's not the fault of the men, it was an olfactory response. So they found the same thing even when they just left a men's t-shirt in the animal room. Even using the bedding or the kind of stuff that the animals sit in, the bedding of intact, unfamiliar male mammals, androgen secretions, all of these caused the same response. And then they went back and actually looked at a bunch of their archived data, and it showed this response. Now, I want to emphasize this doesn't mean that women should be the only ones handling rodents, but it's something important to think about and to, potentially keep consistent, at least within a study of who is handling the animals. So again, I hope you can kind of see how EDI issues in society can trickle down through institutions and into research design. But most importantly, researchers can address EDI and contribute to a positive influence on our institutions and society. So lastly, I just want to look at how can you build your own EDI competency? This might be important to think about, not only because it's, the right thing to do, but, if you're thinking of continuing in a career in research or science or any field, really, any academic field, so many people these days are asking, in job applications about your experience or your knowledge of EDI. So it's worth starting to think about and starting to kind of build that up. I think it's a fairly intuitive process, right? Of self-reflection, knowledge building, integration into your work, and capacity building, and continuous reflection and repeating as you learn new things as you go. There's really no end destination. There's no infinite end to this. It's constant learning. So to really just kind of start, if you're really brand new to this, I encourage you to kind of reflect on your own experiences. Have you noticed inequities in your own environment, perhaps in the field that you're starting to do some work in? Have you spoken to fellow students and colleagues about inequities they've maybe experienced? Really listen to others, because some of us, myself included, haven't necessarily experienced a lot of exclusion, but certainly listen to those who have. What resonates with you, maybe something, maybe racial or gender equity, access for people with disabilities, health disparities. So I'm curious if you've put any thought into this, or if anything, in this presentation even has resonated with you. Would you be willing to share what EDI related issues you might be interested in exploring further in your work? If you want to share a couple words in the chat, that would be awesome.
And I'd be happy to read any that come in. I know that I'm happy to share orally what
Sure.
EDI issue I'm working on, and that's
Mhm.
mental health.
Great. Yeah.
Because it's invisible, and
Yeah.
so finding ways to make sure that we're building spaces where that is understood and included, and yeah,
I appreciate that.
protecting
Yeah.
Indigenous knowledge in academic publishing. So that's something
Oh,
that came up
very
in the chat.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and people might not know yet, right? I mean, there's such a variety and weight to these issues that it can be really overwhelming. So I just encourage you to maybe do some reading in the field that even you're working on this summer. What kind of issues are coming up in that field? Something might pique your interest there.
One of the things we did at USask um, one of the things we did at USask last week, was to screen Picture a Scientist, which is
Mhm.
a documentary around issues of women and unconscious bias in the academy.
Mhm.
And someone asked, could you please include your comments in the chat? I couldn't hear you. So I'll make sure that I put them in as well.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's a really interesting film, and I think I attended your one viewing you did with the panel afterwards, and certainly seemed to resonate with a lot of people. Okay. So of course, this also involves building your own knowledge, right? There's so many resources out there. And again, that can be overwhelming, but I've listed a couple here if you're having trouble getting started. These are just some links to some of our pages in the College of Medicine. This first one has some resources on various topics, including bias, cultural humility, disability and inclusion, calling out racism, gender, LGBTQ2S+. CIHR, if you're doing health research, CIHR has really great training on sex and gender in research. And I encourage you to keep a self-reflection document or a journal or whatever kind of format you like, and track the progress you made, maybe certain skills you've acquired, personal and professional growth in this field. Because when time comes to apply for jobs that are asking about EDI, you'll be ready to really craft a nice EDI statement. Okay. And then integration. So, I do recognize too that you folks, many of you might be just at the beginning of your research careers, but you can start thinking about this. How could this be integrated into your current project? Or maybe something you'd be interested in looking at in the future. Um, are you inclusive of underrepresented populations if you're working with people? Sex and gender considerations. You can be sure to kind of cite diverse scholars. What's the team composition of your group? How about your lab and your group environment? Um, and then for those, graduate students or moving on who are involved in service and maybe even teaching and mentorship, there's certainly ways to incorporate EDI there as well. Looking at, who is on the committees that you serve on, what kind of outreach activities can you do? Even professional societies often have some EDI resources and activities. Looking at underrepresented students and how you can better craft your teaching and mentorship using lesson plans that are inclusive. And I would give a shout out to the Gwen Moss Center here on campus, has really great resources around teaching for these kinds of, for EDI considerations. And then you just want to start building capacity. This work is really hard to do on your own. It's important that you have support and that you feel you have a group of people you can work with on this. Maybe you can bring it up with your peers or even your supervisors if you feel you have that relationship. I like to even encourage just, can you have dedicate a few of your lab or your team meetings over the summer to an EDI paper or something like that. Look at what the university offers in terms of EDI activities and trainings. And again, you can look into the professional societies of your given field and see what's available there. So this is pretty much the end of my presentation. Just a couple extra resources, maybe a couple calls to action. Again, you can familiarize yourself with the USask resources. Indigenous engagement has a lot of great resources and learning there. There's an EDI webpage. And of course, like we said at the beginning, this is Pride Week. You can see what's happening on campus right now. And this second one is a speaker series that we've been putting out from the College of Medicine for the past couple years. And that we have all of these listed on the website with links to the videos. And so maybe something in this list piques your interest and you think, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I'd like to learn more about that. All the videos are there and you can take a look at that. I actually really would recommend this first one too. This was all about accessibility in research. And often I find, of course, it's very important that we're talking about gender and we're talking about racial inequities, but accessibility and disability are often kind of not given a lot of focus. And I think that really needs to change. And this was an exceptionally interesting talk given by a biomedical researcher who is actually blind. And it's a fantastic look at what is some of the things that we don't often think about that we really need to be thinking about. So that's all I have for you. Is there any, I'm happy to talk further, take some comments, questions, etc. I'll stop sharing too now, I think.
And I'm going to actually stop the recording
Okay.
just so that everyone feels as open and welcome as possible to share their thoughts. And thank you very much, Erin, for that presentation. It gives us a lot to remember that as far as we've come, we all have so much work yet to go. And I think that that's an important learning for all of us. And thank you very much.
Yeah, happy to. No, there's always more to do for sure.